Good. Well, it's wonderful to meet you. Thank you for taking a minute after the program. I appreciate it.
Sure, sure.
So I always begin with this question. It was such a big, momentous thing for planet Earth. 6 years ago, this pandemic was changing our lives. How did you get through that COVID era, and how has it affected the way that you do things and live today?
Yeah, no, I think, it's a really kind of not just an important question, but kind of a profound one as it's reshaped us all of us individually and collectively in a million ways. The way I think about the pandemic at this stage now, technically, we're summer of 2026, is that it really forced a lot of us to confront, how much of our confidence in what we've been doing or had been doing at the time was really based on conditions we assumed that would just continue, sort of indefinitely. The way I got through it myself was just by really kind of narrowing my focus. And I tried to distinguish between what I could control, what I could influence, what it was that I had to then accept. And I think that was true for all of us. What helped me remain constructive was, really just kind of becoming consumed or not being consumed by the uncertainty of it. So, from a business perspective, as I help tech CEOs and others as well, is that the pandemic forced me to go ahead and look at something, I guess in a way more strongly today, meaning that, disruption rarely creates, all of the problems that we end up seeing. More often than not, we've got a number of dependencies or weaknesses that we kind of knew were already there, but made them very much front and center. So, it showed us that in the case of, say, myself or even clients and people that I know, that one way of doing things, that one client or one approach just can come completely unglued when it's simply not there anymore. The underlying restrictions and challenges around it just shift very, very significantly. So for me, it's about kind of distilling it down to first principles, personally and professionally, about what's going on and what can I do about it. And then kind of just in the end of it, just I guess go ahead and be less interested in worrying about the future or thinking about it even. It's a bit of a cliche to say that, we all live in the now or in the present, but that is fundamentally true. There isn't anything else. And then just to be more precise about how I help people, businesses, how I take care of myself, and just focus really on that particular piece of it. I think in one way it had me broaden my horizon, lift up my eyes and so forth, as opposed to being involved in some busy work, and then but also narrow it as well at the same time and have it be meaningful for myself and then be meaningful for clients and people around me. So that's been the primary, I think, shift over, we'll call it the post-COVID period of time.
Well, and even during COVID, there was such a dependency on technology. Lots of tech CEOs, lots of people that were in technology. There was a shift in focus. Did you notice that you had an uptick or that there's been kind of a sea change since that time period for technology?
Yeah, it's certainly, as we all are aware, it's certainly accelerated, dramatically. I think what we're seeing are just maybe not a reflection of the pandemic itself, but it's a very powerful illustration of, what can shift and how quickly, and that the underlying assumptions that we have just don't always, play themselves out. We obviously are, using all sorts of technologies, and that's shifted. More people working from home or remotely or no, a nomadic life, if that's, something of interest to people. But it really, for me, I think is, what is it at its core that shifted? It's, I think, some of the hidden dependencies that we thought we had, some of the ways of thinking that proved out to be either brittle or lacked an architecture, lacked a structure, personally and professionally. And then how is that experience, or how have those that foundation, if you will, to think of it as your home or something like that, has changed over time, because we think about time differently. It's something we created as humans, and we have all sorts of structures around which to go ahead and make it work. Calendars and appointments like this one, and lots of other scenarios. But at the heart of it, it's really thinking about, well, what is it that time that we do have here, what does that involve, and how do I go ahead and create leverage around it? And I find myself wasting I wouldn't say maybe wasting time, but thinking about it and reflecting on it more thoughtfully than I have in the past as a result of the pandemic, the post-pandemic, and what it is I'd really like to, to accomplish with the time that I've got left here on this space rock that we're all on flying through infinity. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
for sure. So
yeah.
let's get to the essence of what you do on a daily basis. Means how do you do that?
Yeah, no, that's a very fair question. Very fair question indeed. So essentially, what I do is I help technology CEOs and CEOs in the government contracting space, predominantly as I'm here in the Washington, D.C. area, grow and scale their companies. So they're often very, very good at coming up with an idea and then being able to do something with that idea and to bring people around that idea, ideally to go ahead and create something that didn't exist before and that is solving a problem that is important to other human beings, but oftentimes gets stuck at a certain point. That might be something where their growth stalls or they have other challenges of different types. And so it's helping them shift or move through that and be able to then really accelerate what they're doing to create much, much greater impact.
So when you were that age, what was your dream gig? What did you want to be when you grew up?
Yeah, it's when I was 12, I have a certain love for certain types of motorsports. So for me, at 12, or as kind of right there at that teenage, almost teenage, getting close teenage level for a boy, I did have a fascination with motorcycle and Formula One racing. It just seemed really cool. At the time, there were some very big personalities in that space in the very early 80s. And because the technology was really mushrooming in both of those disciplines, that was something that was exciting to me, was a combination of the glamour, of course, the, zipping around in what looked like a very exciting little car. And then just, yeah, pushing limits in a number of ways.
So take me back to where you were born and raised. What were the seeds that were planted that became who you are, that gave you this technology acumen to help CEOs get to a better place?
I think, the fundamentals can be true for all of us. Is just that I was, fortunate, both of my parents were involved in my life. I have one younger brother, and my dad was a professor and a professor of business strategies. So he did not torture us, thankfully, with business cases at the dinner table. I'm always grateful for that. But as parents do, both a function of just the work that they do, as well as sneaking in educational tips along the way to try and educate their two boys in this case. Was really just talking about human relationships ultimately. Remove the business stuff, remove the other things. It's what is actually important and what shifts that. And when I think about my grandfather and some other relatives, particularly male relatives in my family and the work that they did, I didn't ask them about it when I was a kid. I was too busy learning how to fish and do other regular sorts of things. But a little bit later on in life, it was questions around relationships and people, particularly with my grandfather, as I was struggling with some just understanding people, say in my late teens or early 20s. And it was him just sharing some wisdom essentially at different stages, a quiet time at July 4th to something else up in Vermont. And it was very impactful just to say, hey, you can figure this out. This is something that is fully discernible. You just need to go ahead and take the time to try and figure out what it is, even if you're fumbling around with limited information. So, yeah, nothing, no single event, just more of something where you're listening and learning at the same time and just absorbing insight.
So who's been your inspiration? Who's been kind of the muse or the hero that's allowed you to find your footing in life?
Yeah, no, hopefully everyone has one. There are some people who obviously have not been so fortunate in that regard. For me, it's my dad, is a classic one. A second backup to that would have been one of my grandfathers, but my dad was absolutely number one in terms of he and I are very, very similar in terms of temperament, outlook, that sort of thing. So there was a natural affinity there aside from the usual things where as a teenager I was rebelling or doing other sorts of things that were not always constructive. And But yeah, on the whole, just the lessons, his perspective, how to think through problems, how to just navigate one's world and figure that stuff out in constructive ways. And I think, particularly for boys who obviously become teenagers and ultimately become men, it's really helpful as a guiding post. And I'm always been enormously grateful to have that because that's not been true of lots of other guys, that I've met over the years. There's just other circumstances that have shaped their lives that's different.
So in your line of work, I would imagine you would have to study businesses and CEOs and what's
Yeah.
going on and what trends. When you look at the tech landscape, whether it was when you began or where you're at now, who do you admire? Who has been a company or an organization or a CEO or an entrepreneur mind that you've admired by the product they've made that people come back to,
Yeah.
customer, employee satisfaction, all of those ingredients that make something successful and memorable? Who
Yeah,
who
no,
is the
and I
template?
Yeah, I think, it's a really great question because what's challenging about tech is and exciting about it is that it changes, that there's always something new. And so to find an enduring brand or one that has or where you resonate with is always powerful. I'll cite a very classic example in part because I use their products I have for years. I do like their ethos despite, shortcomings that every company has. And that is going to be Apple. And it's because it really does, I think, a very lovely job of tapping into and connecting with the emotional experience that people have with physical products, but then also technology products, which is a really very, very hard thing to go ahead and tap into on a very personal level. I find that even some of the gear I'm using right now, I do feel as though it always has my back. There's a way of thinking about how they do things that as a result, whenever I have a challenge, I don't know, there's an error message that comes up, or there's some other challenge that I might have. I think, okay, how would this team go ahead and solve this problem? Where is the solution? It's not, as I've done for many years in my professional life, Microsoft is a very solid product, but I never quite felt that they had my back over the years in a way of like, I've never seen that error message again. Let me go on to the forums. There was always a ton and ton of digging. Whereas with Apple, I've always found, okay, this has been considered before. There is a solution to it, and inevitably that's been the case. I've always felt that the company had my back even when there was obviously quote unquote uncertainty about how to try and solve a particular problem. I had one last week with a couple of applications that weren't quite behaving correctly. And while it took time, it absolutely allowed me to go ahead and move forward. And I think that oftentimes we don't feel that in a solution or in a set of products. And I think the way Steve Jobs went ahead and framed how he thinks about challenges and how he thinks about um, people and about solutions, despite being a challenging person himself, as many have attested to over the years. I do think they are one where thinking about kind of before, during, and after a relationship in terms of one's product or service, it's just really, potent. And I would say on a professional level, where I've been doing the work alongside other colleagues, I will say that my former employer, Raytheon, now known as RTX, is a very good company and does live by its values, which for a multinational defense firm that, sells, roughly $80 billion worth of stuff worldwide, you wouldn't think that that would absolutely or that would be there. But considering that complexity and 190,000 people around the world, which is challenging to try and go ahead and manage that and lead that, they also do, having been on the inside of it, do I think a very good job considering the level of complexity and change, as we've talked about, in a world where a lot of that really shouldn't work or be just much, much more challenging and nevertheless is, really the cohesion, the alignment, if you will, to serve is very much front and center. So I would use those two large organizations as examples.
So I've worked in technology for a long time between being
Yeah.
a technician by day and
Yep.
IT director, and there's so many levels of technology that I've understood for a long time. And
Yep.
I think right now, the whole idea of Moore's law is blown out of the water. Everyday technology goes at rapid rates.
Yep.
I firmly believe that human beings have the upper hand with AI right now. But I think my only fear with AI is that we're going to lose that at some point. It's going to become that Arthur C. Clarke spaceship. So
Hmm.
my question to you is, where are you at with this? I mean, it's kind of the double-edged sword. It's the way that tech leadership and tech companies are going to move forward, but
Hmm.
there's also this fear on the back end, this dystopian notion that it can get the upper hand. Where are you at on that whole timeline?
Yeah, there's obviously lots and lots of discussion around AI and what it is, what it's capable of, and then how we use it. Do we have the maturity and the sophistication to be, you know, not so much to tell us ourselves the story of staying ahead of it, but can we lead ourselves in a constructive way with what is a very, very disruptive technology? I think, like you, the answer is yes. I think that we can. I am very much in the uh, augment human skill sets and human powers for good rather than replace. I think that there is a replace. It's an automation tool ultimately at the end of the day. But I think we all appreciate just how potentially problematic this new set of technologies and platforms. And as you correctly pointed out, we hear about a new model or a new shift or something like that almost on a daily basis. And so people are very, very uncertain whether it's individually in these conversations, it's the public markets with shifts around valuation all of the time now. Yeah, so I do. It isn't even just my hope. It is my fundamental belief in the end that will we be able to harness it for good in a constructive way? Yes. Are we going to make some pretty boneheaded decisions that will ultimately make it painful, expensive, and potentially very, very costly in several dimensions? I think that's absolutely true. When you look at our history, and you don't have to dig too deep to find examples, we are not always the best decision maker in uncertainty, and I think it remains to be seen how intelligent we can actually be in the face of what is unclear about what we can do with where that will go, and whether it is the dystopian universe that you mentioned, and I joke about how upside down everything is now in so many dimensions. Yeah, I just think, and it's just part of a bigger whole where we are seeing more profound shifts politically, culturally, economically. Quite a storm has come together in a way that I think is really going to test not just the West or people in the West, but it will be all of us on this space rock. So to be determined, but I'm in the augmentation camp and one where I think we will ultimately build an understanding around it, and that it will benefit a huge swath of people and make things better in the end. Yeah.
For sure. So what is the energy for you every day to deal with the psychology of the CEO, keeping up with technology, taking care of your own soul?
A high level, what I do is I have, a couple of, if you will, tools or approaches. I'm not going to be bold enough to call them philosophies. That seems a little arrogant on my part, but it's a set of foundational elements. So I'm a big fan of a hardcore meditation program that I've been a part of now for quite a few years. My martial arts plays a very big role. I am a pretty naturally disciplined person, so it's been something we're setting up, repeatable structures, or making sure I get to the gym and eat correctly, and all those good things happen on a consistent basis. I think of them as almost foundational layers. I have a bad sweet tooth, so I think of it in terms of layers of a cake and icing. It always frames the whole challenge for me pretty nicely. So it's about doing the foundational or basic elements on a repeated basis and having goals around what those are, such as for fitness and things like that, or friendships, and then build from that. Have those things been achieved consistently in a given day or week? And if not, if life feels stressful or that's the story that I'm telling myself, then go ahead and step back to those foundational elements. I'm not much of a basketball follower, but the, Michael Jordan in the 1980s and 90s was often asked, do you ever get nervous after winning four championships? And he said, yeah, absolutely. I get nervous on game night or on, a playoff and stuff. And they said, what do you do? He said, I do the same thing that I do every time. I always revisit those foundational elements from deconstructing a particular move or doing something else or talking with a colleague, one of my, Pippin or someone else. And I think we oftentimes feel as though we're getting disconnected from that. And so to have that foundation for me is really, really important and something I've always found to be valuable, not just for staying on track, but just understanding almost who I am in many respects. It's had real genuine meaning.
So let's say you have a dream tonight. You run into the 18-year-old version of you ready to go out and change the world. You walk into a room, there's a film projector, you click play, and a 60-second highlight reel of the life you've lived comes up on the wall. Is that
Yeah.
young version of you going to believe your life turned out this way?
Not at all. No, not one bit. If look, reflecting back on being that 18 or 17-year-old or something, to reflect on all of the twists and turns and changes, and it's true of all of us. That I would not expect. I turned 59 this year. Would I have expected I am where I am now? And the answer is absolutely not. Now, I didn't have a particularly rigid or focused direction at 18, not in the way that, I would have been able to predict. I had some general understanding of where I thought things might go, but very, very different. And I would say the advice in short that I would give myself would be to really go ahead and have a much bigger, broader vision that what's possible is much, much greater than you would have otherwise ever thought. I graduated high school in 1985. The shifts that have occurred between then and now in 2026 have been profound, to say the least.
Yeah.
And to simply understand that any fears that you have that or that you might perceive of are by and large false stories, and that really the most important thing for one to do is simply go ahead and define what you would really, really enjoy, what you fundamentally desire, and then go after that. Even if you get sideswiped or the sailboat gets thrown around in the wind and so forth like that, you get thrown off course, and we all do, to nevertheless always have, a clear understanding that, what you can do is much, much greater than what you can actually come up with in that particular moment. So that would have been my lesson, or would be my lesson, I should say, to the 18-year-old version of myself, is absolutely the possibilities are pretty amazing if you're open to being open about them.
So let's get to the real marrow in your bones, Scott. Everyone has a perception of you, family, friends, clients, colleagues, but you run the show. What's your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Good question too, and one that I've really wrestled with. It's something where I've made lots of judgments over the years about myself. I think, quite a number of us can do it easily, around, okay, how do people perceive us? Is it quote unquote good or bad? It ends up being reduced to those two binary sides. And I would say, in terms of other people describing me, because they've done so, I've been through those types of test environments and stuff where I've needed to ask people. They tend to say the same sorts of things, family as well as friends and work colleagues as well. And that is, he's someone who never quits, meaning that he's someone who, once he has a bone in his mouth, doesn't let go. He's a bit too serious, which always makes me smile because it is true. A little bit too analytical, et cetera, like that. But below those line items, or those those layers, there's someone who is absolutely there for you when you don't. Um, when the chips are down and things are really kind of, frankly, shitty, that no matter what, you can always, whatever the communication mechanism is, give me a call or reach out. There's lots of ways to do that now that didn't exist 40 years ago. But yeah, that I do genuinely care, and that the people that I've chose to focus on, say the cybersecurity CEOs who are incredibly jaded, but do fundamentally care, and often care too much. They want to basically make you safe, and most people want to feel safe, but not actually be safe. So yeah, it's that kind of need for a mission, if you will. And as long as I have one, I'm in a pretty good place. When I don't have one, life gets to feel just much more chaotic. So it's about locking or being clear about what those things are that's made the most difference. So that's how I would go ahead and answer that question for you.
Love it. So if anybody wants to learn more about Purple Finch, they want to reach out, contact you, questions, hiring, any of the good business, where do
Yep.
they go?
Yeah, I mean, the best place is going to be probably LinkedIn. I'm on all the socials and things, posting content and stuff for CEOs and whatnot. But LinkedIn is where I'm at most of the time, like most business professionals. So feel free to reach out. By all means, mention the podcast and yourself. It's always great when people do that. And yeah, that would be the best place to reach out to me and where I'll get back to you the fastest.
Okay. I will make it easy. I'll put links in the show notes. Scott, what a pleasure. Thank you, sir. Thank you for your story. Thank you for your time. Best of luck with everything. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for reaching out. I really appreciate the invitation. It's been a lovely chat to have. And all the best with you and the team and your podcast as well.
Thank you. I appreciate it.